In Romans 8:29 to 30, we read a list of verbs which are at the core of understanding Paul's thinking about predestination. God foreknows, God predestines, God calls, God justifies, God glorifies. Paul lists them in a particular order. Whom he foreknew, he also predestines. Whom he predestined, these he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified. Whom he justified, these he also glorified. We see then, before God predestines, before God makes a decision involving a destiny, knowledge is involved. So this knowledge is first, and never after a decision to destine the person. But this is a decision about what? And this knowledge, what kind is it? We see this list of verbs involving to justify. This indicates that the destiny is about salvation. Paul in this same letter had already mentioned being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. To justify then is about salvation. So predestination here is a decision about the destiny of the person involving salvation. What about the knowledge? What knowledge? It reads, whom he foreknew. So the person is foreknown. But again, what specific is known about the person? For the answer, we need to be attached and fully connected to the preceding verses. If we are to understand Paul here, we cannot, if we are divorced from following his train of thought. A text out of context is a pretext. We find the previous inference of knowledge God has about the person in verses 27 and 28. Verses 29 to 30 are fully connected by the fact this is knowledge of the person. Paul expands about what God does with that knowledge in Romans 8:29 to 30. But what the knowledge is needs to be learned by seeing what Paul is saying first. In verse 27, we read about an action of God. Now he who searches the heart, God searches men's hearts. But what is God looking for in the heart? We find this in Romans 8:28. To those who love God. Here we see loving God in the heart is what is in view. So the searching of the heart is to see if the person loves God. The knowledge involved about the person is the fact that they love God. When was this knowledge gained? Answer, when God searched the heart. Can God search a heart before a person exists? No. How do we know this? How do we know that God always searches the heart of people who are actually living and breathing? Because that is how God does it throughout the Bible. And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. When was this? Answer, during 40 years of being in the wilderness. However, regarding the ambassadors of the princes of Babylon, whom they sent to him to inquire about the wonder that was done in the land, God withdrew from him in order to test him, that he might know all that was in his heart. When was this? Answer, during the visit of the ambassadors. When God says to Abraham, now I know that you fear God, since you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. When was this testing? Answer, when Abraham was seen to go through the sacrificing of Isaac his son, which God prevented at the point of seeing Abraham was going through with it. God testing the heart is important in the Bible. I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give every man according to his ways and according to the fruit of his doings. For the righteous God tests the hearts and minds. I am he who searches the minds and hearts, and I will give to each one of you according to your works. But when God searches the heart is in a person's lifetime. So, when we read God foreknows, why is that? If this knowledge of loving God is gained in the lifetime of the person, why is it called foreknowledge? It is because, again in context, we see that the person is seen not to know what to pray for. For we do not know what we should pray for as we ought. The saints, like the Old Testament saints, pre-Christian, do not know what to pray for to be conformed to the image of his Son, until they are justified by knowing that redemption that is in Christ Jesus, which happens when they are called. So, what do we read? We read that God knows after searching the heart in a person's lifetime, that the person loves God before the person knows what to pray. So the foreknowledge is about God knowing ahead of the person involved. This makes sense of Romans 8:28. Oidem de, but we know. Hoti, that. Tois, to, for the ones. Agaposi, they are loving, they love. Don theon, God. Panta, all. Sunege, he works. Eis agathon, into good. Kata, according to. Prothesin, a purpose. Kletos, called. Usin, they are. But we know that he works all things into good for the ones loving God, for they are the ones called according to a purpose. Note, his, in front of purpose, is added by translators who understand the passage without the context. His is not in the Greek. The purpose is the loving of God seen in the heart. Now, prothesis equals purpose is the word used in Hebrews 9:2. Ke he prothesis ton aton. And the presentation of the loaves, often shortened to showbread. It is about the showing, the presentation. Robert Young's Concordance defines prothesis as a setting before, purpose. And what was being displayed after God had searched the heart? Answer, the loving of God. This is the purpose in view, the display of intent. According to that is what makes God then work all things into good. This is what is then expanded upon by Paul in Romans 8:29-30. Paul wrote, whom he foreknew, he also predestines. Whom he predestined, these he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified. Whom he justified, these he also glorified. Do you really believe Paul is speaking of something divorced from the preceding verses? Conclusion. In Paul's conditional predestination, we read, God searches the heart. He sees a display of love for God. He then works all into good, namely, he foreknows before the person. He sets up, he predestines the person, so they are called. They are thus justified, and all justified are glorified.